Section 16 of Secret Service, or Recollections of a City Detective. The Workhouse Doctor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Marina 47. Of all scoundrels in society, there are none so bad as disreputable or dishonest lawyers, unless it be unprincipled doctors. And I think that the palm of villainy, if there be such a thing, might be claimed by a few of the latter class in any competition with the former. There is no limit to the mischief, and no fathoming the depths of crime which a surgeon may commit. Few men, perhaps, have also such ample opportunities for eluding detection. It is fair to say that I believe the crime of dishonesty or malfeasance is rare among that most honorable profession of medicine and surgery, but the exceptions, although few, are terrible. "Doctor, you have been very good to me," said an old woman, "and I have done wrong to you, and hope you will forgive me and be kind to me, for I am a poor lone old woman, with no friend in the world but you, doctor." The doctor smiled blandly at the compliment here paid him. This old woman was a pauper patient. The doctor attended her by order of the relieving officer of the blank Union, the locality of which, it is enough for the reader to know, was on the south side of the metropolis. The doctor had been many years a parish surgeon, and at this time he was also the medical attendant at the workhouse of the Union. He was accounted a successful man. He was in large practice, but his gains were not commensurate with the extent of his business, and owing to a somewhat large family, with expensive habits of his own and his wife's, he had not made, after all, very much way in the world. I think I may describe him as a poor doctor, although he lived in a big house and kept up a liberal establishment. Yes, I may call him poor. There were unmistakable, although negative, signs of comparative poverty. He kept no carriage, and had to trudge on foot from the beginning to the end of his daily rounds. He rarely indulged in the luxury of a cab, which, I take it, showed either an extreme prudence, not consistent with some other habits I have mentioned, or very straitened circumstances. Yes, Goody, I hope I have been kind to you, and I will be kind, as I know a doctor ought to be to all his patients, but especially to all the poor and old ones. I ought to have mentioned, incidentally, that the doctor had obtained a reputation for his urbanity to all people, and his especial affection to the poor. "Doctor," she exclaimed, "I have something on my mind. I don't think I have acted properly by you. Will you forgive me?" As she spoke these latter words, her wretched crone-like features betrayed a ghastliness which appalled the surgeon, and he could scarcely for several moments answer her. "You will forgive me, doctor, won't you?" "Forgive you, Goody? What have I to forgive you?" "Oh, it was very wrong to deceive you." "But how have you deceived me?" "Oh, it was very wicked." "Why, what's the matter? What do you mean?" As the doctor uttered this last interrogation in soothing accents, he drew a chair near to the old woman, and in the extremeness of his urbanity, or with the desire of a confessor to lighten the load that weighed upon her conscience, as he so drew his chair by her side, he actually took her lean and withered hand in his. "Come, tell me all about it, Goody. In what way have you wronged me? In what deceived me? In what respect acted as a poor woman should not?" "Well, doctor," she stammered, in reply to this kind and confidential inquiry, "indeed I have a fortune." The doctor started. "Pray don't expose me. I shall die if I am found out. Kill me, doctor, if you won't forgive me." "A fortune? And you for so long have been living on charity, obtaining relief and medical attendance from the Union. Oh, that is wicked indeed." At this moment there passed through the doctor's mind a thought more wicked than any of the thoughts or acts of the pauper patient. He was then walking the streets of London, attending his patients, earning his own bread and his family's bread by the sufferance of a Christian usurer, who had obtained judgments against him on bills of exchange, and who extracted, as the price of what he called forbearance, enormous interest and costs for a disreputable attorney, who, let me say in confidence, I have reason to know divided them with his client. The bitter poverty of the man was his strong temptation. Could I manage to get this woman's property into my hands? He asked himself. No, was the answer of his conscience. It would be an enormous blessing to me if I could get a little money just now and pay off that infernal Tompkins, who threatens and harasses my life during the 24 hours in every day, whose sheriff's officer ghost haunts my steps from the moment I leave my door in the morning till the moment I return at night, who disturbs my repose at home, and the fear of whom disturbs my sleep. If I could get the use of the money, I would repay it. To wrong this wretched pauper would be a crime I am incapable of, but to use the money of the old sinner for a while, and make it up again, would do nobody any harm. I will try if I can get it. Such was the train of thought, interrogation, and reply, and of resolution, which passed through the mind of the doctor with more rapidity than it has passed under the eye of the reader. My good woman, as you say, you have acted very wrongfully, not alone towards me, but you have, in that respect, done a great injustice towards me. By what means can I live and maintain my family, than by the exercise of my profession? If you could have paid my fees, you should have done so. I would willingly have attended upon you as long as you lived, without charge, if your necessities had required it. But as you could pay, I think you ought to have paid. Doctor, it is but little I possess, and I have always been afraid of spending it or reducing it. It is only £500 that I have, and if I lost it, I should lose my all. How do I know that I shall not want it, every farthing? And I have a son, for whom I have kept it these 10 years. Where he is now, I don't know. He left England in a ship for the Indies. He ran away from his home during his father's lifetime, and I believe he helped to break my husband's heart. But he used to write me long, long, and such nice letters, and used to tell me that he would come home some day. It is a very long while since I heard from him, and maybe he is drowned. But I don't think he is. Sometimes I dream of him, and in my sleep I think I hear a voice telling me that I shall see him again. When he comes home I will give him all I have, and I am sure he will be kind to his old mother, and keep me happy and comfortable as long as I live." While the old crone thus garrulously related the secret of her miserly thrift, the doctor was pondering over a scheme which he had already matured. "Well, my good woman," he said, "it is not my business to tell upon you. I will not bring you into disgrace. I will not reproach you. From me, at least, you shall suffer nothing." "Thank you, dear, kind, good doctor." "Will you not pay me something on my account?" he inquired. "Oh, yes, doctor." As she spoke, she rose from her seat and went to a cupboard, from which she took a little box and unlocked it. In this box were contained 2 savings bank books. How extremely cunning this old lady had been! How well, for one in her position and at her age, did she understand that difficult rule of prudently investing money. She laid these books before the doctor, again imploring him not to let anybody know of her hoard. "I will give you £10, doctor," she said, "as soon as I can draw it out from the savings bank." "I am much obliged to you," observed the surgeon meekly. The old woman was struck, perhaps flattered, by the comparative humbleness with which the doctor acknowledged the proffered money. That acknowledgment reduced him to something like the level of his patient. The confidence at this moment became that of friends, and when the sea of conventionality had been bridged over, the two talked tete-a-tete. The doctor pointed out to the old woman the perils she ran, by fire, robbery, or other accident, of having her books destroyed, and the evidence of her investment, or that investment itself, obliterated. She listened to this demonstration with greediness and anxiety. She saw the force, not to say truthfulness or disinterestedness, of the suggestion. He pointed out to her the comparative profitlessness of the mode of investment she had selected. He told her that money was worth twice, thrice, fourfold, or even tenfold, under careful, judicious management, the amount she was receiving for it. The greediness of the old woman was aroused. There is nothing so tempting to the over-thrifty and penurious or miserly person as the offer of large interest. This is a weakness they share with the common usurer, who is met with in the ordinary walks of society. I believe it would be possible to cheat an ordinary Jew bill discounter or the most subtle and acute of Christian usurers by the temptation of large interest and a little manipulation of their great ruling instinct of greediness. The pauper patient, before this interview had been concluded, entreated her good kind doctor to lend her the benefit of his extreme practical sagacity, great worldly experience, and unmistakable judgment in the investment of the moneys which had been saved up by her. After a little hesitation, he agreed to comply with her request. Within a fortnight the money was withdrawn from the savings banks in which it had been distributed, in order to evade those regulations which prevent more than a certain sum being at any one time invested in any one bank. And after being withdrawn from this channel, it was placed in the hands of the surgeon, for him to lend or employ as he might deem expedient, and upon those securities that would yield a larger return. The doctor used the money thus entrusted to him in payment of claims which pressed upon himself, and in reduction of his own embarrassments. He paid the old woman, or rather carried to her account, an interest of 20% per annum with the greatest regularity, and his conscience was satisfied by a belief that he was conferring upon her an essential benefit, by enabling her to obtain this liberal usufruct, in preference to the scanty dole of interest she had been receiving. He satisfied scruples, or rather prevented her distrusting him, by from time to time showing her bills of exchange, documents, or papers, which he called bills of sale, and slips of paper which he denominated scrip, railway shares, etc., etc., all of which, he explained to her, were bringing interest at a rate more than 4 times that she had been previously obtaining. Goody thus learned to regard the doctor, who alone possessed her secret and stood in the relation of her confessor, as her best and sincerest friend. She occasionally rewarded him, as she thought, by purchasing little presents for his children, and by an occasional visit to the hosiers or glovers to make some slight purchase for his own benefit or comfort. After 2 years or thereabouts had rolled away, Goody, whose physical infirmities increased, whose mental knowledge became more and more warped, whose miserly vices had become more intense, also became dissatisfied with the irregular mode in which she obtained the charity upon which she continued to live, while in her imagination she saw her investment increase. One day the doctor called upon her to explain that the interest upon a railway debenture fell due tomorrow, and £4 15 had been thus obtained, which he was prepared to either hand over to her or hold for her investment. She told him she would much rather that he kept all of it except a shilling, which she needed for some purpose, and which sum he gave her. He promised to lay out this further amount, as he had laid out all the rest, in a way to increase its store. "There," she then continued to say, "I have been thinking that I feel very lonesome and very uncomfortable here by myself, and I should like to get into the house." "What? The Union Workhouse?" "Yes, doctor." "I am afraid it cannot be done." "Oh, I am so sorry. I wish it could. Can't you manage that for me, doctor?" "Well, you see, Goody, somebody might find out that you have money, and I might be ruined if it were to transpire that I had assisted you, or even suffered you to become an inmate of the workhouse, and to live out of the ratepayers' money." The old woman was crestfallen. The idea which she had nursed for many months seemed dashed to pieces. Her hopes were destroyed. The doctor continued, "I am afraid it would be hardly right, Goody." "Nobody could know that I had money, doctor, unless you told them." "I should not, of course, think of disclosing it, and perhaps, after all, it might not be so very great a crime for me to let you take your own course. Only mind, I won't help you. My conscience will not let me do that. It would ruin me if found out. No, Goody, if you can get into the house, I will not be the man to tell upon you, but you must get in by yourself." The doctor by this time had begun to tremble, lest every moment the old woman should demand the delivery up of her securities, and should discover that he had used the greater portion of her money. He knew that he could not recover or replace it. He was at his wit's end oftentimes to determine what he should do in such an emergency. He therefore liked the idea of this old woman's going into the house, where he knew she could get, because the additional falsehood and imposture of her position would be an added security for her silence. While there, she would hardly dare to claim from him the money or the documents. he would have far less difficulty in maintaining the secret of his fraud upon her than he had hitherto done. It will be enough to further state that the old creature made application for admission into the Union workhouse, and that the relieving officer investigated her case, that a report was laid before the Board of Guardians, and that, without much difficulty, she obtained an order of admission. So the fraud upon the ratepayers was effected and prolonged, so the doctor's crime was further concealed. The old pauper was accustomed in the house, and out of the house, when permitted to go beyond its walls, to laud the praises of her kind doctor, who, on his visits to the place, would inquire after her, who would find her very often ailing, and who very frequently ordered her luxuries that did not fall to the lot of other paupers not so cared for. 3 years rolled away, and during this time the pauper grew richer and richer, as she thought, out of the usufruct of her savings. The doctor all the while continued with growing certainty to look upon the fund he had employed for his own advantage as money he would never be called upon to replace. He had only to keep up the deception a little longer, and the real owner of that fund would pass into her grave unnoticed and unknown. One day the old woman obtained her customary leave of absence, and wandered beyond the usual track of her accustomed visitations when so liberated. She called first upon the doctor, and obtained from him a small sum of money, a few shillings, and afterwards, among the places she visited, was the miserable home of an old acquaintance. Here she took dinner and tea, and after tea drew out the money, which she said had been given her by her dear kind friend the parish doctor, and insisted upon standing treat for her companion. About 9 in the evening a conversation took place between the two women. "Goody," said her friend, "you know I don't want to hurry you. You know I am very glad to have you here. I am very fond of you, but it is getting late, and if you don't make haste, you will get shut out." The speaker was what is called a little the worse for liquor, and Goody was more than a little intoxicated. She spluttered out in reply something about not caring for the porter, or the relieving officer, or the Board of Guardians, or the overseers, or the churchwardens, or anybody. That if she was late it did not matter, and that she would not stand any of their nonsense. That if she was late, why, she was late. If she could not get in the house, she must stay out. And if they did not care to keep her, why, she could keep herself. "What nonsense you talk! What would you do, at your time of life, to keep yourself? Why, if they were to turn you out, you must starve. You could not work, and you have not got anything to live upon."
"Oh, haven't I, though?" the old woman incoherently exclaimed. "That is all you know about it. I don't care for them all. Dr. Jalap has got my money. He takes care of it for me. Why, I tell you, I have got a fortune. That is, I mean, he has got it keeping for me. I have got more than £1,000. Is not that a fortune? Would not you like to have it, old girl? I dare say the chairman of the board would like to have it, but he won't. No, that he shan't. I won't go back to the house. I will stop here. There, go and get a quarter and more gin." With the shilling now produced, another quartern of gin was fetched, and the old lady imbibed a further quantity, and got considerably worse, and was soon reduced to a state of beastly, hopeless, and helpless intoxication. After having drunk themselves into this condition, the two wretched creatures left the scene of their dissipation, and endeavoured to toddle in the direction of the workhouse. They had not gone far when 2 riotous boys, returning from their work to their homes, saw them reeling, and began to poke fun at them. The female pauper, smarting under a rude juvenile insult, endeavoured to rush forward and seize one of the delinquents, but instead of effecting the capture of the offender, fell flat on her face. Her companion endeavoured to pick her up, but rolled over, and while the sympathetic woman maundered in her intoxication words of consolation to the disfigured pauper, a policeman came up, and observing their condition, took them both to the station-house. Next morning, on being brought before the magistrate, they told an artful tale, which that worthy functionary accepted as true, about having met an old friend, who treated them to a half-quartern of gin. They were sure it was no more, and it overcame them. They were discharged with an admonition, and toddled off to the house, at the gate of which they parted, the one to find her home, like an independent woman, the other to seek into her ward, and bear the gibes of her associates as best she might.
It was some time before these women could meet again. When they did so, among other things, they talked about the fortune. Goody the Pauper would have liked to have said nothing about the matter, but her companion was not to be put off in that way. She had a principle which led her to argue that what people said in their cups might be regarded as their most sincere belief, and that the words uttered in drunkenness had a truth not always attaching to the words of soberness. She persisted in her inquiries, and the result was that the pauper Goody took her friend into confidence.
"Why, you see here," she said, "nobody knows what may turn up. I have been a lone woman these many years. I have got a son, leastways, I believe I have, and some day he may turn up, you see. I love that boy, and I have screwed and contrived for him, and in case anything should happen to me, why, I should like to have a little money by me. So I saved and put my money in a savings bank. But then one day I told the doctor about my money, and he told me not to let it be there. I asked if so be he would be so kind as to look after it for me, which he said yes, he would do so. So I gave the money to him, and he lays it out, and gets me the best interest for my money, and I place that interest along with the money, which makes the money bigger, do you see, every year. I have done this for many years, and now I have no doubt I have got hard upon £1,000.
Lor, you don't say so.
Yes, 'pon my honour, I have.
Well, I wish I had got £100, that's all I know.
100 is not much,
said Goody, whose ideas were prone to expand on financial theories. In this way the couple chatted, until Goody's friend became almost as wise as Goody herself upon the matter of the investment, and the doctor's fiduciary relationship became equally well known to two females, as it had previously been known to one. Now, it is said that women cannot keep a secret. I believe this doctrine is not to be accepted or taken as a rule without exceptions. But it is certain that Goody's friend prattled and tattled long and pertinaciously, although in solemn confidence, to a variety of people. At last the fact or fiction of the pauper's fortune became known to Mr. Doe, a popular baker, and chairman of the Board of Guardians of the union which had the honour of maintaining out of its public funds the wealthy pauper. Mr. Doe was a man of independent mind. How he won his way, as he frequently had occasion to say, to the distinction of a member of the vestry and chairman of the Board of Guardians, was by his own talents, sometimes, he said, genius, and his untiring energy and his uncompromising honesty. He was not the man to overlook any abuse. He was the last man in the world to permit a fraud to go unnoticed or unpunished. When he heard of the case of this female pauper with a fortune, he determined to sift it to the last. He told the story as he received it to his colleagues or subordinate members of the Board of Guardians, and a subcommittee was appointed to investigate the matter. The clerk to the board was directed to write to the doctor demanding from him an explanation. Upon that, the board dropped the subject for a fortnight, in order that, as Mr. Doe said, everybody might have ample opportunity for their proper defence against the grave charges he had to make against them. The doctor still held his situation of medical adviser and attendant to the workhouse. The female pauper was unfortunately ill, and at the time when this outcry arose she was an inmate of the infirmary or sick ward. The doctor was then in attendance upon her. When the surgeon received the letter, he was of course naturally amazed. Long-continued success and concealment had led him to confidently believe it was unknown to anybody but himself that he held the money. How the secret had leaked out he could not tell or guess. A conversation, which he found no difficulty in obtaining, with the patient did not help the solution of the mystery, for she, like an old sinner that she was, denied having mentioned the thing to a living soul. She affected to be as much in the dark as he was as to the mode in which the intelligence had reached the board. She did not affect to be, but really was, terribly alarmed by the discovery. The doctor heightened that alarm by telling her she would be prosecuted and punished, no doubt sent to the treadmill, or it might be transported for fraud upon the Board of Guardians. He told her that the only course for her to adopt was one of entire secrecy. She must deny everything. She must declare she had never said that she had money, utterly deny that he had received any from her for any purpose, and if she did so, he would back her statement up by declaring that he had none of her money in his control. The poor deluded wretch saw that she was placing herself entirely in the hands of her doctor, and that he might turn round upon her, or at least she thought so. But still, as between the treadmill and transportation, she hesitated to run the risk of the doctor's possible fraud upon her. The meeting of the board took place. The doctor, in reply to the letter sent him, wrote a short, pithy answer, declaring the statement touching him and the female pauper and patient to be a flimsy fabrication which he thought it beneath him to answer in detail. He gave his unqualified denial, and should do no more. As for entering on a defense against such accusations, why, his character was before the world, and he left the guardians to judge the mere probability of such a statement as that which had been made by somebody to his discredit. If the guardians felt inclined for any further information, perhaps he might be disposed to give it, but his present opinion was that he should not. The female pauper, on being brought up before the guardians for examination, or to speak more correctly, a deputation of the board, or its committee, waited at her bedside. She stoutly denied everything. She declared most solemnly that she had no money, and asked the inquirer, if she had such money, would she be there, in that wretched infirmary, on their bed, in unsavoury pauperism, and taking the noxious workhouse physic? One member of the deputation was convinced that the chairman had led them on a wild goose chase, that the woman had no such fortune as had been represented, that the whole affair was a bag of moonshine. Another had no opinion at all. He said in frankness that he did not know what to make of the matter, and a third had a notion directly contrary to the first, and thought the ratepayers had been swindled for a long while, that the chairman of the board was quite right, and that the matter ought to be further looked into. It unfortunately happened between the date of this inquiry of the baker and the deputation that the pauper died. Poor creature! She expired under the treatment of her friend and conspirator against the ratepayers, the Workhouse Doctor. That death was a godsend to him, for it practically stopped all further investigation. The chairman of the Board of Guardians, Mr. Doe, at the meeting when the report of the committee was brought up, expressed himself dissatisfied. He said he thought he smelt a rat. He had his suspicions that the doctor had got the woman's money. He was sure, almost certain, that the ratepayers had been robbed. He would like to have the whole thing out, and at once. He did not like that evasive letter of their surgeon's. He should like that gentleman brought before them at once, and be asked to explain. If he came and did explain, well and good. Mr. Doe would not object to apologize when he had been convinced that he had been in the wrong. Until he was so convinced, he should hold his own opinion and vindicate it. The upshot of the whole investigation of this worthy and energetic and prosperous and dignified tradesman was that the surgeon was sent for by a special messenger, and that he attended their deliberations at the board meeting I have last referred to. He manifested a lofty spirit of mock dignity. He protested against the outrage to which he had been subjected by their suspicions and by their demand, and by having him arraigned before them like a criminal at a public tribunal. He did not know that he was doing it all right in noticing these charges, but concluded by laying his hand melodramatically upon his heart, offering many objurgations, and ultimately, in the most familiar way, offering to prove, as he did prove, to the satisfaction of the majority, and the dissatisfaction of the minority of the board, that the tattle of the chairman's informant was a tissue of falsehood, or the wild imaginings of a lunatic. The sequel to the whole of these incidents and this investigation was a resolution, passed by a majority of the board, expressing confidence in their medical officer, embodying an opinion that he had been unjustly aspersed, and requesting him to continue to bestow upon the paupers of the Union under the control of that Board of Guardians his eminent services and truly Christian-like mercies. End of section 16.
Section number 17 of Secret Service, or Recollections of a City Detective. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Avery Wade. Secret Service, or Recollections of a City Detective, by Andrew Forrester. The Missing Will. Mr. Franklin was a solicitor, in good practice at the West End of London, having offices at Blank Chambers, Regent Street, and a private residence near Fulham. He was a man of somewhat peculiar habits, although very shrewd, able in his profession, and generous towards his friends, who were not a few. His domestic life had been far from comfortable. He had been separated from his wife through incompatibility of temper, and that lady, with one of her children, lived in a distant part of the metropolis upon a liberal allowance from his purse. This description will cover the life and pursuits of Mr. Franklin during a series of about 15 years. All this while, and probably much earlier than the beginning of this epoch, he saved a considerable portion of his earnings and invested it with that success a prudent lawyer was able to command. He was not, it is true, what is called a speculative or enterprising man. He was rather a plodding or hard-working man. He had a notion that lawyers ought not to engage in risks, lest they should be tempted, in the frenzy of greed or to cover some unusual loss, to use the money which clients might by necessity or choice leave in their hands. He never made lumps of money, but grew rich by slow degrees, as the accumulated installments of his frugality were piled on each other, and as the usufruct thereof, year by year, swelled the total of his husbanded gains. At the head of his staff or firm was a managing clerk, and at the top of his rather small establishment in the country was a housekeeper. In both these persons, Mr. Franklin had the utmost confidence. That comfortable feeling, I suppose, grew out of long experience, but it was not one I found it possible to share on my first introduction to these worthy persons. The clerk exhibited all the salient features of his calling. He was cunning, reticent, and conceited. I dare say he was faithful to his master. Fidelity is a peculiar merit of the attorney's clerk. I've known many in my time, but never knew one treacherous to his master, and never heard, on reliable authority, of one who betrayed a client's secret. I have often had occasion to know that bribes have been offered to the wretched copyist, whose earnings have probably not averaged £1 per week, and to office lads whose wages were but a few shillings, bribes equal to at least a quarter's honest income. But not a secret could be extracted in this mode. I have often mused on this phenomenon, but I never could fully understand the exact relation between the cause and the effect. The reader is perhaps a better psychologist than I am, and can explain it. I leave the fact in his hands or head, merely vouching for it as a fact. As I have said, there was this faithful clerk at the head of staff in Mr. Franklin's office. The housekeeper who presided over the domestic economy of the lawyer's dwelling was a very ordinary sort of person. She was somewhere about 48 or 50 years of age. She was rather tall and somewhat bulky in her form. Her features were a little harsh. Her voice was not one that could be described as musical, and her manners were not of that order denominated ladylike. She also was a faithful servant, or at least she very often told me so, and I have no evidence to the contrary. She declared to me, soon after my introduction to her, that she had never robbed the good man, that is, her then late master, of a penny. She had always laid out his money to the best advantage, never got a commission from the tradesmen who supplied butter, cheese, eggs, or other comestibles, and in fact never plundered him after the manner of her sisterhood. She was, in fact, and I take it for granted and ask the reader to assume, a model housekeeper. This is a censorious and scandal-mongering age. I cannot, I fear, rely upon it that my pages may not fall into the hands of some one or two persons always ready to suspect and say ill of their neighbors. Let me therefore at once clearly and emphatically state that no relationship whatever subsisted between Mr. Franklin and this lady, but the ostensible one of master and servant. On this head there ought to be no doubt. Mr. Franklin one day, after a short illness, died. The fact of his death was almost immediately communicated to his relatives and friends, who mingled a few natural and conventional tears over his dead body, which in due course was interred, without needless pomp or ceremony, in a churchyard not far off. After and before the funeral, much surprise was expressed at the non-discovery of a will. Had he made a will, or had he died intestate? On that head there was much speculation, and many decided opinions formed. Some folks argued that it was very foolish for a lawyer, above all men in the world, to leave his intentions undisclosed, and bequeath a negative legacy of trouble, distrust, suspicion, heartburning, and social war among his acquaintances and kindred. They didn't think he could do it. Others contended that there was nothing remarkable in a solicitor's not making a will. These persons may be divided into two classes. One lot cynically remarked that shoemakers' children were usually worse shod than other brats, that the offspring of tailors were to be usually known by the seediness of their costume, that publicans never drank the liquors they vended, that parsons rarely illustrated by their practice the virtues they taught in their pulpits, and that a lawyer should betray a crowning want of prudence was not, therefore, wonderful. This was the reasoning by which some were led to the belief that Mr. Franklin had certainly not made a will. Another lot sneered at this circumlocutory and unsatisfactory process of argument. They said that the thing was plain enough. The deceased was a lawyer. He well knew and was satisfied with the arrangements made by the wisdom of the legislature for the distribution of the personal estate of intestates. Against all this speculation there was, however, the unswerving and oft-repeated declarations of the managing clerk, who said that his late master did, about 2 years before his death, make a will. The draft thereof was in the handwriting of Mr. Franklin. He had also engrossed or copied it for the executors with his own right hand. The attestation had, however, been made by that faithful clerk and by that rascal Edwards, a junior clerk, whose skill in the imitation of autographs had secured him gratuitous and comfortable board and lodging at Portland. If the deceased made a will, where could it be? That was the knotty and interesting question. In its solution, nobody took a deeper interest than the housekeeper. If it could be found, it would. She was as sure of the fact of her existence, and of this, as she had never heard the Berkeleyan theory propounded, she had not the slightest shadow of a doubt that it would secure her the reward of long and meritorious servitude. The relatives and friends who desired to find a will, and thought she might aid in its discovery, promised to reward her if her faith were not justified by the document when it turned up. The clerk was also zealous in searching for it, everywhere that his sagacity pointed out as its probable lurking place. Neither will nor draft of a will could, however, be found. The office and the house were ransacked. The safe, all the tin cases, drawers, and bundles of papers were critically examined without success. Suspicion, it is needless to say, was rife. It must have been destroyed, was the conclusion almost uniformly arrived at, and the delinquent was marked out by the imagination of several. The lawyer's only son, who had been a riotous youth and a sore trouble to his father, was the suspected criminal. It was notorious that this young man had drawn heavily upon his parent from time to time. He did not like the honorable profession of the law, and in order to accommodate his taste, Mr. Franklin had paid considerable premiums to men of repute in other professions. But the student, or the apprentice, forfeited the money thus paid at different times for his benefit. He had twice robbed his father of large amounts. The lawyer's patience and affection had apparently been exhausted some time before his death. The son, deprived of all allowance by which to sustain an idle life, was ultimately compelled to gain his living in a comparatively humble position, and when the father died, he was earning £1 a week in a merchant's counting-house. Mr. Franklin, Jr., who lodged with his mother, heard of his loss as soon as that lady did. He at once threw up his engagement under the vague belief that a fortune had been dropped into his lap. He practically took possession of the offices in the house of the deceased and had abundant opportunities of getting rid of any document obnoxious to his interests. Uncharitable rumor, therefore, set down as fact that this young man had ascertained that an indignant parent had cut him off, with or without the proverbial shilling, that the missing will was the instrument by which his just punishment had been effected, that he had discovered the will, and in it his fate, and that in order to gain the benefit of the statutable distribution of the estate, he had destroyed both the document and the draft thereof. About a fortnight after Mr. Franklin's death, I was instructed to probe the mystery of this lost will. It was chiefly desired that I should find the will itself, but that was thought a hopeless task. The next thing desired was that I should get clear evidence of its former existence, its provisions and bequests. It was also desired that I should get evidence enough to sustain a prosecution against the young man. My task, which appeared almost hopeless and not likely to be profitable, turned out short, easy, and satisfactory. A brief investigation of overlooked circumstances informed me that Mr. Franklin had protected a young woman who, in consequence thereof, bore him 2 children. This attachment he had managed to conceal from all of his friends and acquaintances, and some of them were greatly scandalized at the discovery of such an offense against social morals. I called on this lady, and in my first interview went right through the mystery of the will's concealment. The poor creature was awfully embarrassed by my inquiries, and immediately I thought it wise to let her know the real object of my visit. She fancied herself a delinquent. "Upon my word, sir," she said, "I didn't take it. He gave it to me. He told me to keep it until he died, that it would be my only protection after his death, and that I was to only give it up to Mr. Thistlewhite." I saw the whole design of the late Mr. Franklin. I asked her to let me see it. She replied by an entreaty that I would not take it from her, for she asked, "What will become of me and my dear children if I lose it?" It was plain that the unsophisticated woman knew nothing of legal formalities, and hugged the paper as though its mere possession would obtain the money it set apart for her. I promised her that I would not deprive her of it, that I would certainly aid rather than frustrate the intentions of the father of her children. Of its contents she could know nothing beyond the general statement of the deceased, that all her future protection was bound up in its provisions. The will had been handed to her in a closed envelope. The wax was unbroken when she laid the packet before me. How to act did not require a moment's consideration on my part. It was not my duty, and it was repugnant to my feelings to place this young woman at a disadvantage. In finding the will, I had done more than what was hoped for, and all that could be expected from me. I advised her at once to consult a respectable solicitor, and she went with me to the office of a gentleman in the neighborhood, a total stranger to me except by reputation. The erring son of the deceased was cleared from suspicion. The will was proved at Doctors' Commons, and the intentions of the testator were faithfully carried out. One of the persons largely interested in the residuary estate of the deceased, which formed its bulk, was much grieved because of the depository chosen by Mr. Franklin for the safe custody of his will. "It is not," said this person, "as if he'd left the creature a large sum of money. I don't complain of the provision he's made for the unfortunate children, but he might have spared us the humiliation of asking her for the will. Why could he not have left that in the custody of some one of the respectable people to whom he's given the principal part of his fortune?" The explanation was, "Why don't you see, my dear madam, that although the creature had but a small interest in the estate, that interest depended entirely upon the preservation of the document. As the bulk of the property was distributed by the testator, nearly the same as the law would of itself have distributed it, he had small occasion to make a will at all, except to provide for the creature and her offspring. He chose the safest of all places in which he could deposit it, as of course he did not wish it destroyed by any of those respectable people, who would not have been much concerned if the mother and her little ones had been left absolute paupers.
Do you mean to suggest that either of us would have destroyed the document?
Certainly not, but I apprehend that the deceased thought it quite as well to preserve you all from temptation. End of section 17.
Section 18 of Secret Service, or Recollections of a City Detective. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Secret Service, or Recollections of a City Detective, by Andrew Forrester. The Duke's Mystery. Little more than 5 years ago, a series of robberies on a grand scale was perpetrated at the West End of London. There was hardly a tradesman of note who did not suffer from these depredations, which for a long while baffled all the skill and vigilance of the police. After a lapse of perhaps 6 months from the formation of the belief that these robberies were the result of a concerted action by the rascaldom of the metropolis, the victims and their friends formed themselves into a committee, and I was retained to investigate the affair. As the matter had by this time assumed great importance, I employed 5 or 6 assistants, and systematically went to work. The police were also on the alert, and special instructions were given from Scotland Yard that they should cooperate with me, or practically, I may say, act under my instructions. It would be tedious to relate all the disguises and stratagems which I assumed and devised. It must suffice to say that 6 men went through more variations in their appearance than the chameleon, and were nearly or quite ubiquitous during the investigation. I saw that a gang had to be crushed. I knew that success or failure was but an issue of time and money. Of the former, I could give and get as much as the associated tradesmen would pay for. Of the latter there would, I believed, be no stint. The parties affected, and liable to be affected, by the operations of the gang, were prepared to lay out all the cash needful to secure the punishment of the criminals. The job was not a light one. We made a few mistakes to the injury, however, of no one who had a character worth keeping. We got at times on wrong tracks. We were often on the heels of the thieves, and yet failed to grasp them. We were none of us faint-hearted or lacking in patience. Each trip only made us walk the more carefully. Each blunder only made us wary. Each divergence only made us examine the supposed clues with greater nicety. One morning a police constable and one of my men came to me with news. "We have a clue, sir," said Police Constable U-99. "That's well. What is it?" I observed. "At least we think we have," said my assistant. I told him of it. "I found it out," added the constable. "No, don't say that. I had most to do with it." "How do you make that out?" "Well, how much did you know about it before I told you of it?" "And how much did you know when you told me of it?" I saw that there was a pretty quarrel brewing between this pair of worthies, and I tried to stop it. But that was not so easy a task as the reader may at first be inclined to suppose. If I put a restraint on my assistant for the sake of peace, I might be incidentally puffing up the constable's vanity, and wantonly injuring the laudable pride of my own staff. If I attempted to curb the policeman, I might drive him off to Scotland Yard, where the clue would be followed up, and my own professional credit with the tradesmen injured. I must put up with a little of this altercation, and endeavor to soothe the irritation of both. The fact is that somebody, an omnibus driver, I believe, had told the police officer that something he was accustomed to see was a jolly rum affair. The policeman, being on the beat along which my man had to travel, and knowing him, repeated his information, and echoed the busman's opinion in his own vernacular. My assistant joined in the opinion already expressed, and went beyond it. "It is a rum affair, as you say," observed my man. "I think," he added, "that it's a clue to what we very particularly want to find out. You come up to the governor with me tomorrow, when you're off duty, and I'll introduce you. If we turn it to account, mind, he'll not be unhandsome. He'll make it worth your while. That I warrant." They then chatted over the business, and I dare say my assistant let the officer into the secret of our instructions far enough to aid his comprehension of the gravity of the effects to which this clue might lead. What, then, was this clue? I dare say, asks the always impatient reader. It was a small matter. It did not seem to point directly at the information I wanted, but many a real clue has not been more definite or reliable than that now to be followed to its end. It was a little nut which required cracking. There might be in it the kernel I wanted, or there might not. With nothing like regularity of time or periodicity, but with great frequency, a shabby hack brougham might be seen about or after dusk, proceeding along a road leading through a western reach of the metropolis into the most picturesque western suburb. My clue began with the vehicle at the northeastern corner of the Green Park, and ended just on the eastern entrance to the village of Blank. It was a suspicious fact that this hack brougham was not driven by the same man throughout the entire distance. One driver was met about halfway on the road when he alighted from the box and handed the whip to the person, always the same, who met him. The brougham was one of those registered at Somerset House as a cab. It was a private vehicle, which appeared like the property of some indigent postmaster or jobber. Where could this vehicle go to and come from? Among the difficulties in our case was that of tracing the goods. It was, I confess, not a little remarkable that no part of the goods could be traced. We had searched all the most notorious fences. I do not think there was one known place in which goods of the kind in question would be brought that we had not examined. Could this brougham be the means of conveying the plunder in small quantities to and from its place of concealment, to the place or places of conversion into money? Those were questions we determined to solve. A diligent watch was set at stages from the Green Park to Blank. Next evening the carriage did not present itself, nor the next, but on the third evening it was seen to emerge from a lane in Piccadilly, near to a street in which there is an inferior livery stable. It was now followed and kept in sight during its entire journey. I saw the driver changed. I critically scanned the hirsute visage of the rider. Just outside the village of Blank, on the high road, there stood and yet stands a cottage residence in not the finest state, with coach-house and stabling for more carriages and horses than the occupants seemed to make use of. The house was, I may also explain, shut out from the view of travellers by a close wooden paling, a high gate, and a tall, dense, leafy hedge. At this cottage the brougham stopped. The rider alighted, and the servant placed the horse and vehicle in the outbuildings allotted to them, which were entered by the rear. All this looked to me very suspicious. I determined, however, to pursue my inquiries. There was not yet enough evidence, in my own opinion, to justify an application for a search warrant, and less justification for anyone's arrest on a criminal charge. Inquiries in the village and neighborhood elicited not much, but the few scraps of fact that we did get tended to fortify a suspicion that here was a depot of the plunder. The tradespeople were pumped, but those wells of gossip or scandal were nearly dry. The truth was, this cottage neither excited remark by ostentation nor the reverse. What it required, it ordered and paid for. The trade done with its inmates by the shopkeepers who were honored with their patronage was not large enough to arouse the envy of their rivals. It may astonish some people, who are tormented by scandal, to know that rumor may be either avoided or manipulated if you know how to go about the task. While I was engaged in these inquiries with two of my assistants, the man who had the words with the policeman, as described, had another, and what he called a jolly row, with that officer. The matter was, I believe, through this, mentioned at the headquarters of the Metropolitan Police, and the authorities took it up. An active sergeant of the detective police called upon me, and asked for information, which I thought myself scarcely at liberty to refuse to give, so I gave it. He forthwith set to work, and got warrants to search the premises and arrest the inmates. The time he selected for pouncing on the suspects was 12 at night. That evening, the shabby brougham turned out of the livery stables, wended its way through slush and traffic along Piccadilly, and at about the usual spot the driver was changed. Away the brougham went again, at a slightly accelerated pace, as though the horse's head was lightened. The party alighted at the cottage, and the stable was occupied as before. About 12:30, a body of police effected an entrance into the cottage by the rear. The whole of the small household was aroused. Great was the consternation of Miss Goodwin, and her brother was nearly killed by alarm. Of the rest, not much different can be said. Groom and coachman, one person, housekeeper and general servant, also one person, who completed the human establishment, were awfully frightened. The highly intelligent sergeant insisted upon ransacking the house, searching the stables, and exploring the garden. In the meantime, the lady, gentlemen, and servants were told to consider themselves in custody. In vain the gentleman protested against this outrage, and sometimes gently threatened to bring down all the vengeance of the law upon his sister's tormentors. The sergeant treated the threat with disdain, and ridiculed the claim of his prisoner to kinship with Miss Goodwin. All entreaties, menaces, expostulations, and threats were answered by references to his duty, or intimations that he knew what he was about. The search and exploration revealed nothing. The officer was sorely disappointed, but not yet discomfited. He saw that, at all events, he was safe if he went on, and that if he turned back he might expose himself to the charge of negligence. There was enough that was wrong, more than sufficient that was mysterious, to cover any excess of vigilance or any stretch of duty. So on he resolved to go. When Mr. Goodwin was told that he must accompany the officer as his prisoner, and that the lady must also share that inconvenience, they again put forth every form of remonstrance. All were useless. The officer was inexorable and unbelieving. He rudely expressed his disbelief of the assertion that the fair tenant of the cottage was a pure and innocent young lady, of small independent estate, and that the visitor was her brother and guardian. Those explanations, he said, might do for the magistrate tomorrow, but they would not do for the police. There was no getting out of the awful mess. Mr. and Miss Goodwin were removed by the sergeant under his warrants to the chief metropolitan police station, and there confined in vulgar cells. At times during the wretched journey to London, the prisoners were defiant, and at others they sank into despair. Once, on the way to the metropolis, the lady remarked to her companion, "Never mind, dear George, we're not thieves. They have searched my house in every part, but they have found nothing." "Now," observed the officer, "don't say anything that'll injure yourselves while I'm with you. I don't want you to criminate yourselves. Only mind, I shall give all that I hear as evidence, and I don't mind saying that I don't like the look of things. Found nothing. Well, if that sort of talk ain't thieves' patter, I don't know what is. I ain't found nothing yet, but if I get a remand, won't I find nothing?" Mr. Goodwin shuddered. Miss Goodwin was eloquent in the form of denunciation. The gentleman, by the time of the arrival of the party at the station house, had recovered his self-possession. He demanded the means of communicating with a solicitor. This was afforded him. He chose the name of a well-known criminal practitioner, one of the cleverest and one of the most respectable of his class. The professional man recognized his client. He had before been employed as the agent of that client's family solicitor in a prosecution. Within 10 minutes after the arrival of the lawyer at the station, the door of Mr. Goodwin's cell was opened, and that gentleman with his attorney were shown into the head private apartment of the officer who lives on the premises. Miss Goodwin was also looked after with as much tenderness during her stay in this urban hostelry. After a short further interview between the attorney and gentleman, and a few words with the lady in compulsory waiting, a conference was held between the magistrate, his learned clerk, and the attorney. Mr. and Miss Goodwin were then next shown into his worship's private room, and the brother and sister were liberated on their own recognizances. Nothing further was done in the case against the occupants of the suburban cottage. Nothing was done by that lady and gentleman against any other person for setting the law in motion against them. The vigilant sergeant got promoted. On what theory and by what influences, let the reader guess. Was it as a reward for past clever and prudent service? Was it the price of perpetual silence? Was it the seal upon a mystery? I cannot explain why the sergeant was thus dealt with, but as much of some other things as I can properly explain, I will. First, let me say that I had no further interference by the police with my plans for the detection of the real thieves, and that I hunted them down to conviction. In the second place, I may inform the reader that Mr. Goodwin was no other than an alias for His Grace the Duke of No-Matter-Where, a nobleman who boasts of a long pedigree, and whose own father was not a little proud of the historic traditions of the house of No-Matter-Where. The living Duke has a large rent roll, an almost infinitesimal portion of which goes to Miss Goodwin, who, although not a sister, is in very intimate relationship towards him. He had reasons of his own, I dare say, for the quiet, or, as I should say, mysterious manner in which his visits to the cottage in the western suburb were shrouded. End of section 18. Read by Verla Viera in Las Cruces, New Mexico, USA, December 2023.
Section 19 of Secret Service, or Recollections of a City Detective. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Secret Service, or Recollections of a City Detective by Andrew Forrester. The Attorney and the Smuggler. Tommy Johnson was a smuggler of the modern school, about which it is hardly necessary to say more than that it differs considerably from the old or the ideal school. Neither Tommy nor any of his men were the picturesque ruffians that schoolboy imagination describes, under the tutelary genius of well-known romancists, nor did they much resemble the full-booted, rollicking giants which low art in common pictures invariably makes the bold smuggler. Tommy the smuggler chief was a short, stout, ruddy-faced, good-humored fellow, who lived much as small tradesmen, of whom he was also one, live in that part of the south of England, to which he belonged. Everybody, it is said, liked him, and he liked everybody, except the revenue officer. Of Johnson's kith and kindred, nobody knew, and few cared to inquire anything. Whether Tommy was his real name or not, I am uncertain. When on one occasion, being in trouble, he was asked by a local magistrate, who his friends, perhaps meaning his relatives, were. Jovial Tommy, with a show of distress, replied somewhat as that eccentric child of the Rev. Mrs. Stowe Topsy might have done, that he expected he hadn't got any. There was, however, too much modesty, or a little untruth in this. Tommy Johnson had hosts of sympathizers, who were prepared at all times to do him any service in their power. Rumor for many miles about his place of abode gave him credit for being what he really was, a smuggler. Tommy felt it necessary sometimes to vary the compliment, but not always. He never went so far as to repudiate having defrauded the revenue. He was rather pleased to hear folks embody in words the popular theory that there was no harm in robbing the custom house. He did not care to hide from some people that he did now, and then run a vessel clandestinely between a Dutch port and some mysterious point off a craggy side of the Isle of Wight. He did, however, usually prefer to be known as a man who had once been in, but now retired from, that business. Tommy, who was an otherwise prosperous man, once determined that he would indeed give up his perilous and unlawful business or profession. "My dear," he once observed to his loving wife, on their return from church one Sunday evening, "I'll cut smuggling. I think it's time I did. We can afford it, you know. This here business, the butcher's shop, pays. The inn at P. would honestly pay of itself, and the brickfield turns out right." "I wish you would, with all my heart," his wife replied. "I will. My mind's made up." "You have said that before, Tommy," observed his sweet partner, "but you can't do it. I wish you could. You must be a smuggler. It's the fun of it you like, as you say, I suppose." "Well, yes, I will. I've quite made up my mind. When I do really make up my mind to anything, you know I do it. I'll have just one more run, just one more, and then I'll drop the game, and stick to the trade on land. That's what you said the year before last. Do you recollect the time, Tommy?" Tommy shuddered. He made that promise to himself, and kept it by running a lugger from a port in the Netherlands to one of his points of concealment here. The affair turned out a bad one. The Coast Guard discovered the arrival of the boat, seized the craft and its contents, and Tommy Johnson also, and ultimately lodged him in the jail at Winchester, where he had to undergo a long imprisonment, pending the arrival of the assizes. That the smuggler then had friends was here demonstrated. The facts were as plain as they could be, but their interpretation or bearing on the question of guilt or innocence was left to the jury, who had the law expounded for their guidance with all possible certainty. Tommy Johnson was acquitted in the teeth of evidence and the strength of a sympathy between himself and every man in the jury box. Let me, however, return to the last conversation between Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. "I would have cut it after that," he said, "but it cost such a sight of money. What with the loss of the ship, and all the rum, brandy, and Hollands, and the hard money I paid lawyer Swelling, we were almost ruined. I couldn't stop that, neck or nothing. I must go in again, but now we're on our legs again, thank God, and I'll drop the game after one more slice of luck." Having made this resolution, Mr. Johnson next day proceeded to execute it. He drew out 2 good round sums of money from different banks. A fine lugger, a perfect beauty, as he declared, was soon afterwards bought, and she was in due course freighted with liquors on a neighboring coast. I happened, not many weeks after this, to be travelling as an outside passenger by the coach from Cowes to Ventnor, in the Isle of Wight, when 2 revenue carts, heavily laden, passed us on the road. "My eyes!" exclaimed my driver, and addressing a man who swayed the whip in the first cart, he inquired, "Whose is that lot?" "Tommy Johnson's, we suppose." "Poor fellow, unlucky again," sighed the coachman. The last venture that was to crown the honest resolution had then failed, and worse had to be encountered. The repentant smuggler was again locked up in Winchester jail for a weary succession of months. The case had already been established against him by the clearest evidence. Tommy's heart dropped. His rotund form became elongated. His cheeks lost their plumpness and their color. His garments hung loosely about his person, and his mind was ill at ease. This was the 4th time Tommy Johnson had been put on his trial for a like offense against the laws of his country. Each time his case was, in the opinion of his legal advisers, more desperate than before. The facts were not each time stronger, but the prejudice against the prisoner increased with his reappearance in the dock. Tommy and his wife resolved that no expense should be spared over the defense. Mr. Swelling of Gosport, who had been so very successful on former occasions, was again instructed and told to lay out as much money as he pleased in briefs to counsel. I reckon that he made a fine thing out of this bold modern smuggler. £400 sterling were paid to him on account at starting. Another 100 were given to him before the jail delivery came around, and there was a balance yet to be liquidated, for which, however, the attorney agreed to give time. Now suppose that he gave Mr. Needy, the indefatigable junior counsel, in all £25, which is far over the mark, and that Mr. Silkyarn, the eminent leader, got in all £75, which is a vast exaggeration. Allow £50 for the slight further costs out of pocket, and it will be seen that the attorney made a handsome profit. But there was yet a balance to be settled. The days previous to trial were days of anxiety to the smuggler and his wife. Their intensity, of course, increased as they approached the grand ordeal. At last, the day arrived on which, for the 4th time in his life, Tommy Johnson was placed on his trial for smuggling in the assize court at Winchester. Again, to the surprise of his own attorney and counsel, he was acquitted. The explanation of this miscarriage of justice is easily found. The arrest of Johnson caused a sensation through the entire county of Hants. He was, as I have said, a jovial man, and a kind-hearted fellow in his way. Rumors spread the story of his dashing adventures far and wide, exaggerating and intensifying their commonplace into wild romance. This alone fascinated the public mind, but again, rumor having taken Tommy Johnson under her protection, just as she wantonly injures so many others, she made the very most she could of his merits. Every single act of kindness he had ever performed was magnified 100-fold, and the common smuggler became a hero. I verily believe that Tommy Johnson could have got 100 acquittals at as many consecutive assizes. I don't believe that a jury could be found to pronounce that awful word guilty to an indictment preferred by the Crown against him. Tommy Johnson, after his acquittal, returned home in a condition which an original mind has described as that of a wiser, sadder, and poorer man than he was prior to the last run. He, however, laudably determined not to make another adventure. He would not seek through new perils to retrieve his loss. Without any claims to the character of poet himself, he drew philosophy from Hamlet, and resolved to bear the ills he had rather than fly to others which, his lawyers had told him, he could not fathom the depths of. He would stick to the safe pursuit of fortune on land, and not tempt the perils of the deep in the way he had done. In one of his soliloquies on this point he observed that he had made money at it, but he was afraid that he had used up his luck. He couldn't stand those long imprisonments, and he couldn't always go on dropping thousands into the hands of the Coast Guard and the lawyers. On the whole, he was decidedly of opinion that smuggling was objectionable, on many grounds and for various reasons. So he did, in fact, at last resolve to give it up, and he kept that promise. Mr. Johnson, in less than a fortnight, being so anxious, as he said, to get the affair off his mind, wrote to his attorney to ascertain the exact balance due to that able and worthy man. The lawyer answered by a note, which led Mr. Johnson to call at his office with about £150 in his pocket. "Well, Mr. Johnson," observed the attorney, stretching out his hands with frigid cordiality. "Sit down. I am glad to see you, Mr. Johnson, very glad indeed. I never thought I should have succeeded in getting you off the last time. You owe a great deal to me and to your excellent counsel, Mr. Needy and Mr. Silkyarn." "Oh, yes, I'm quite obliged, sir, I assure you," Johnson interposed, with the hope of abbreviating the homily. "Of course," continued the lawyer, "I am bound to do the best I can for my client, who is in a difficulty. I am glad that I did succeed in getting you off. But prevention is better than cure, you know, Mr. Johnson." "Of course," exclaimed the impatient client. "And," the attorney went on to say, "let me give you a bit of sound advice, gratis, moral, and religious advice, as well as legal, Mr. Johnson. Let me assure you that although I dare say you think there is no harm in it, it is as wicked to plunder the revenue as it is to rob a private individual." "I can't see it in that light," said the unconvicted smuggler. "It is so, upon my honor," replied the attorney. "Think over what I now say. Reflect upon the matter, Mr. Johnson, and you'll see I'm right." "Well, that's an affair for tomorrow. Let me see. What did you say your balance was, sir?" Well, I said I'd take 100 guineas in final settlement. That is, £105, Mr. Johnson." Johnson counted the money in notes, and handed it to the attorney, who laid it on his table. A moment's silence followed. It was broken by the attorney, who did not quite understand the look of the client, and as he feared that Mr. Johnson might be thinking the cost excessive, Mr. Swelling turned the theme. "Now I hope the next time you retain my services, they will be needed for some different purpose. I should like to see you make money and invest it in land or houses, and let me prepare the deeds." "Yes, sir, you shall. When I can get the money to buy the land and houses." "Well, till then, good-bye, Mr. Johnson," said the attorney, rising to bow out his client. "You forgot, sir, I think, to give me a receipt. And I don't think I ever had any for the money I paid you in the prison." "Oh, very well, Mr. Johnson. Certainly you can have a duly stamped receipt, if you please. But I hope you don't suppose that I want to cheat you. I should not like to think you reward my anxious services on your behalf by entertaining such an unjust suspicion of me as that. No, sir, oh no, nothing of that sort. Only, as you were a-sayin', that it's as wrong to rob the revenue as it is a private individual. I thought, although I don't see things quite in that light, that you ought to give me one." The attorney's moral philosophy cost him 7 shillings 6 pence. He bit his lip and sat down, and as penny receipts had not yet been invented, he wrote on a stamp of the above value a receipt for all the money paid him by the smuggler, who rather enjoyed the joke he had played off on his legal adviser. End of section 19.
Section 20 of Secret Service, or Recollections of a City Detective. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Secret Service, or Recollections of a City Detective, by Andrew Forrester. Swindling according to Act of Parliament. I think that the merchants and traders of England, Scotland, and Ireland, or the chambers of commerce of the United Kingdom, might lay out a fair sum of money in a worse mode than by retaining me to illustrate, through my experience, some defective acts of Parliament under which, as I have seen, frequent, palpable, and sometimes gigantic villainy is perpetrated. Whether this notion of my usefulness to the mercantile community and the state is justified or not, by anything I can show, the reader may judge from the following, which is one sample of a stock in my recollections. An honest, struggling, and not rich but moderately successful trader in the city of London not long ago was told that a certain firm, Messrs. Volier and Onlaver, who had offices or at a warehouse not many hundreds of yards from the mansion house and somewhat near to the cold abode of Gog and Magog, and who had an establishment in Paris, might do business with him in a certain class of goods. The trader, Mr. Brown, although not able to bear losses and therefore somewhat cautious, was at the same time naturally anxious to do business. He inquired the standing of this firm. His friend could not tell him, but said that other friends of his, Messrs. Downey and Grabble, were traders with these enterprising Parisians, that Downey was the very model of scrupulousness, and that Mr. Brown might go and ask him to say confidentially what he knew about or thought of the Frenchman. Downey and Grabble are first-class people, I can assure you. If they say right, all is right. And if they say don't, then I say don't trust Volier and Onlaver. That's all. Brown thanked his friend. Next day, as a matter of course, Brown called at the London office or warehouse of Volier and Onlaver, which for geographical definiteness I may also explain was not far from the High Court of Relief in Bassinghall Street. He had samples of goods in his pocket. The agent and buyer of the French firm was in his proper place behind the counter. Firstly, a formal explanation and inquiry or two passed between these gentlemen. What class of goods do you say you can offer us? Alpacas. They will do for the Paris market just now, but we must have them cheap. We don't want long credit. They are a job lot. I can offer them low for cash or short credit. Our terms are cash at 30 days. But let us see your samples. The samples were laid on the counter, critically examined by the intended buyer, and approved. Mr. Brown was also content, subject to references, with the 30 days credit. Well, he said, Continuing the dialogue, I am quite satisfied as to the terms of credit. But as this is my first transaction with your house, I should like a reference, which if quite satisfactory, as I have no doubt it will be, I'll send in the goods at once. Oh, that's quite right. Let me see. Who shall I give you? Do you know Downey and Grabble? Yes, I know them very well. That reference is quite satisfactory to me. Ask them, then, what they think of Volier and Enlever. Mr. Brown went direct to the counting house of Downey and Grabble. Both members of the firm were out. He called again and saw the two members of this very respectable house. The visitor went direct to the business on which he had called. I am told you are dealing with Volier and Enlever. Yes. They are good, then? We suppose so, said Downey in silken tones, or we should have nothing to do with them. And as he spoke, he turned his eyes upon his partner. Grabble added, Perhaps it would be more satisfactory to this gentleman if we showed him our account with the house he inquires about. Here, Clark, let me have the ledger. The ledger was brought. It showed a large amount as due from Volier and Company to Downey and Company. I see, said Brown, that you have confidence in them. You'll, however, excuse my being a little particular. I am a poorer man than you are, and although I am anxious to do business, I must be careful not to make bad debts. What goods are they you have to sell? Inquired Grabble. Alpacas, said Brown. Ah, yes. They are wanted in Paris just now. Volier's might sell an immense lot of those, I should think. It's a good opening for you. What credit do they want? Asked Downey. 30 days, said Brown. It's as safe as the bank. You are sure to get your money at the end of the month. I know both Volier and Enlever. They are young men belonging to first-class families and as sound as Copestakes or Morleys. Brown thanked Downey and Grabble and went on his way to his own little warehouse, rejoicing in the confident belief that he had done a good day's work, that he had netted a 10-pound note that morning. The goods were sent in with all convenient speed by Brown to Volier and Enlever. By their agent, the alpacas were not forwarded to Paris, perhaps because they were needed in the home market. The Paris house had, as Downey and Grabble well knew, a means of disposing of all sorts of textile or even fectile products, much nearer to the city branch of their operations than the French capital. There was, in the neighborhood of the London Rialto, a house kept by two kind-hearted members of one of the tribes of Israel, in which any conceivable quantity of goods that any other firm or house could buy on credit might be taken care of. And these benevolent Hebrews would at all times not only warehouse the aforesaid goods, but they would also oblige trading Gentiles by advances, of course for a consideration under the name of interest, up to a certain proportion of the value of these goods. Now, reader, don't call this process by an ugly name. If you have read the former stories in my volume, you will be aware that this mode of disposing of goods is not called pawning. That is an obnoxious word, never breathed among city men, or allowed to taint the air between Temple Bar and Aldgate. This mode of raising cash and getting off commodities is called hypothecating. Is it not a nice phrase? The process is undoubtedly sanctified by the title. Now, it so happened that a man who traded in the city of London and had done business with the firm of Volier and Enlever, and whose goods had been hypothecated with the Hebrew benefactors, did not admire the process. He had seen his goods supplied to the enterprising Frenchman on the strength of one of Downey and Grabble's oral testimonials, safely housed by the Israelites, and he determined that he would exert his utmost power and influence to prevent other men's wares intended for Paris from a like diversion of their route. This man, by watching and inquiry, found out that the goods lately belonging to Brown, and now the lawful property of Vollier and Enlaver, to do as they liked with, had been sent to the hypothecators. He called upon Brown, who he saw had been made victim of, and gave explanation which reflected upon the character of the houses of both Vollier and their reference. Brown was a little alarmed, but philosophically remarked that the mischief had been done and there was no help for it. In fact, he yet hoped, on the strength of Downey's testimonial, that the money faithfully promised in 30 days would be paid in due course. Before the day when Mr. Brown's money became due, the English branch of the house of Vollier and Enlaver was shut up. Letters addressed to the chief establishment in Paris were returned through the dead letter office. The firm had become dissolved, the house had run away, and no man could discover its whereabouts. Mr. Brown saw that his money was lost, unless he could make those rascals Downey and Grabble pay. To this point all his thoughts were directed. He felt quite convinced that these respectable traders knew all about their continental friends, and that it only needed a searching investigation to prove the complicity of the houses through whom he had been defrauded. At this state of the affair, I was employed. My inquiries soon unraveled the whole plot. It turned upon a simple fact, but the surrounding incidences of the narrative were remarkably unique and interesting to the mercantile community. In fact, Downey and Grabble were in the first place taken in, and nearly done for, to a large amount by Vollier and Enlaver. The persuasion of the Frenchmen had been more than a match for the craft of those Englishmen, who originally hailed from the county of York. One day, about a fortnight before Mr. Brown's visit to the London warehouse of the Frenchman M. Vollier and a fair country woman, who was not Madame Vollier, were proceeding along one of the quiet streets of the city. In the afternoon, not many hours before the departure of the tidal train by which they intended to quit the British metropolis, when that elegant gentleman was tapped on the shoulder in the politest manner by a man who turned out on further acquaintanceship to be an officer of the Sheriff of London. The Frenchman was conveyed to the sponging house over which this officer presided, despite his protests and the lady's tears. The creditors, Messrs. Downey and Grabble, had made an affidavit that the debtor, M. Vollier, was about to leave the country with the view of hindering and delaying the recovery by them of the money to which they were entitled. And upon the strength of this oath, one of the learned judges had authorized the detention of the Frenchman until he paid the demand, gave bail for its payment, or liquidated the obligation in bankruptcy. Messrs. Vollier and Company's agent rushed to the office of a skillful attorney, who was instructed to do his best for the prisoner. This gentleman met Mr. Downey and his lawyer in the reluctant lodgings of M. Vollier, that unlucky man being present. A quarrel was cut short, or nearly prevented, by considerations of prudence. M. Vollier's attorney led the discussion into a practical current by saying to his opponents, "I tell you plainly that my client can't be put in bail, and he won't lie in prison. If you don't voluntarily release him, I'll file his petition in bankruptcy. It was foolish on your part to lock him up. He can't get the money to pay you while he is here. But if he has his liberty, he might do so. He's a clever fellow, and will not stop yet a while unless you are silly enough to stop him. If you let him alone, taking care not to trust him any more yourselves, but not thwarting him or destroying his credit, you may easily float out in the course of a month or two. Mr. Downey and his attorney were struck by the ingenuity, if not force, of the argument, but not quite persuaded to release the debtor. "Can you offer us any security?" Mr. Downey's advisor asked. "No," was the terse rejoinder. "Then I don't see the advantage of liberating your client," added the creditor's attorney. The negotiation would have broken off at that point, but for the Frenchman's ready wit. He had a resource. He had a small contingent property in France. It was valuable enough to cover the debt of Downey and Grabble, although not to be easily realized in this country. He didn't like to part with this, his only fortune, to a stranger. A Frenchman is literally and absolutely nothing, if not always sentimental, and occasionally lachrymose. M. Volier shed tears when he agreed to part with his little contingent estate to his inexorable creditor. Then, having exhausted his natural emotions, he returned to business, and the negotiation was renewed. It was ultimately settled on Downey's giving his assurance, upon the honor of a gentleman, that he would afterwards do what he could to prop up the house of Volier and Onlaver, that is, by giving favorable references as to them. He and his partner should have an assignment made to them of this contingent estate. The sentimental Frenchman further stipulated that when he paid the amount due to Downey and Grabble, as he expected to do very soon, the creditors should retransfer the estate. The compact was ratified by solemn pledges of honor. To save appearances, it was arranged that one of the firm of Downey and Grabble should go to France, pretend to make inquiries about the respectability of Volier and Onlaver, and telegraph back all right, as an excuse for the liberation of M. Volier. The reader will see the necessity for this. Downey and Company could not venture to speak favorably of the man they had arrested unless some excuse could be found for an altered opinion. Downey and Company would not, of course, tell anybody of the arrest of Volier, but that ugly fact might withal leak out. How to reconcile the contents of the affidavit which led the judge to order the Frenchman's arrest with the subsequent eulogisms was the moral difficulty to be surmounted. It is needless to say that the argument of the Frenchman's attorney must not be repeated, and the security they had obtained must not be mentioned. The possession of that document was a palpable sign of a want of that confidence upon which ordinary credit rests. An inquiry on the spot into the respectability of the French house seemed to all parties the most effective way of getting up a show of justification for a good character to be lavished on the swindlers. Downey started by the next train and boat to Paris. He had for his companion M. Volier's madame. This little circumstance was not, I believe, mentioned to Mrs. Downey, because she had a jealous disposition. Within an incredibly short space of time, Mr. Downey made all the inquiries he deemed requisite, and was enabled to dispatch the welcome message, "all right," by the harnessed lightning, as he promised. Next day, Volier met Downey in the French capital, and the next were spent in the same place. During this time, Volier and Onlaver introduced the English merchant to theaters, cafes, casinos, and more recondite places, by way of further evidence of their respectability, prudence, and commercial trustworthiness. Downey had gone through all this circle of inquiry and returned home to London before Brown called upon him to ask his opinion of the Frenchman. It is a pity that the respectable British merchants, when they gave Mr. Brown the testimonial by which he lost his goods or his money, did not expose the basis of their faith in Voliere and Enlever. They surely ought not to have concealed the security in their possession, the arrest of their debtor, or a few other small incidences. I thought the respectable members of the house of Downey and Grabble deserved punishment as criminals. It appeared, however, that no part of the criminal code could touch them. As yet, moreover, it was on the authority of a lawyer of repute in the city of London not possible to recover by an action at law the value of the goods supplied to Voliere and Company on the strength of their English reference. But I had not yet finished my investigations. I soon after this alighted upon a grand discovery. I got hold of all the confidential correspondence between M. Voliere and the English manager of their house. This young man, who had been more sinned against than sinning, also assisted me in tracing the delinquencies of his masters and their confederates or supporters. The correspondence was exceedingly interesting. M. Voliere, who was the principal correspondent, knew English as well as his mother tongue, or he was entitled to rank among the highest of the French littérateurs. The pathos was fine. The letters had such passages as these: "We are in sore distress for money. Buy goods anywhere, sell or dispose of them anyhow, and send us here to Paris the money, or we are ruined quite." Then there were worldly maxims which would have done credit to Captain Barabbas Whitefeather, such as, "Pay no cash, it's a bad principle, get everything on credit." The most unique passages were, however, those in which the Frenchman explained to his English agent how the trade protection societies were to be managed, hoodwinked, or bribed. In the interest of trade, I must, however, conceal this part of the swindle. It now appeared to me that by gathering up all the items of fact and uniting the written with the oral evidence, my case against Downey and Grabble was complete. A solicitor was consulted, and he took counsel's opinion on the matter. That authority pronounced that the evidence would not sustain a criminal prosecution, and in truth Mr. Brown did not care much about that to him barren remedy. He wanted to promote the welfare of society in a mode that would recoup his loss. He wanted to compel Downey and Grabble to pay the amount they had induced him, solely by their representations, to trust the Frenchman. In the way of even this there were, it was thought, some difficulties. That eminent old lawyer, Lord Tenterden, had been many long years ago at the pains to provide a statutory immunity for people like Downey and Grabble. Mr. Brown, as an Englishman, ought to have known the laws of his country. It is presumed that every man has all the written and unwritten, the common, the civil, and the criminal codes engraven on the tablets of his memory. But Mr. Brown did not know it was requisite for his safety that the many representations of the English firm should be written down in unblushing ink. Even if he had known so much as was requisite for his security, he might have relied upon the mistaken supposition that Downey and Grabble were truthful men. In the hope that this case had features which took it from under the mischievous aegis of Lord Tenterden, in reliance upon a notion that Downey and Grabble would not dare to allow the cause to reach a public trial, and also prepared to risk something in the interests of the mercantile community, Mr. Brown brought his action against these respectable men. It cost him something, did this resolution. He had to employ first-rate counsel, whose fees were not small. The cause was defended. Downey and Company knew that this was but one of the series of claims which, under the like circumstances, might rise against them. At the trial, all the facts I have mentioned were clearly established. The learned counsel who led the plaintiff's case denounced in terms of just severity the conduct of the defendants. The judge, the jury, and the spectators would have been glad to see financial equity enforced against the wrongdoers. At the conclusion of the evidence Mr. Brown was able to offer, the counsel for the defendants argued that he had no case to answer. He took his stand upon the Act of Parliament. He did not attempt to deny the merits of the plaintiff's case. He could not answer the damnatory facts. Upon the dry technical question whether or not Messrs. Downey and Grable were shielded by the obnoxious statute, there was a long argument which ended in the judge's expressing an opinion that he was afraid they were, and the plaintiff was non-suited. The respectable house of Downey and Grable did not long survive its damaging triumph. It had ceased to appear in the London Directory, and its members have found it requisite to their comfort to immigrate beyond the limits of a most unenviable notoriety.
Section 21 of Secret Service, or Recollections of a City Detective. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Amber Holcomb. Secret Service, or Recollections of a City Detective by Andrew Forrester. Matrimonial Espionage. Among the curiosities of my experience, I reckon the incidents of the narrative I am about to relate. A few years ago, a gentleman of considerable estate, one of the untitled nobility of England, called upon me, and explained that he had reason to suspect the fidelity of his wife. I did not recognize the force of these reasons. The fact on which this gloomy, although partial, faith in the lady's impurities or falseness had been raised might, with strict literal accuracy, be described as trifles light as air. This suspicion was, however, not to be wholly disregarded by a stranger at first blush of the case. My visitor's station in life, his intellectual qualifications, and his affection for his wife appeared like guarantees that he would not condemn her without cause. He did not, however, assert with confidence that she was guilty. All he had, or professed to have, was a doubt. He told me that nothing would give him more delight than a perfect conviction that he had been under a delusion about the lady. Perhaps it would be well to describe somewhat more fully the actors in this curious little drama. Mr. Percival was the only son of a wealthy and improving landowner in the country of Sussex. He had, in consequence, inherited his father's whole landed estate, together with a large sum of money and considerable investments in public funds and other reliable securities. His education had been well cared for. He lost his mother when only about 14 years of age, and his character had, it is probable, suffered from want of a chastising influence of maternal care. This was, however, the only defect, if it were a defect, in his training. His father had anxiously watched the conduct and development of his youth. He had been educated at Eton, where he excelled in more than one branch of study. At Oxford he took honors. He was a superior type of class known as country gentleman. His habits were those of a man of culture and a man of fortune. Mrs. Percival was a lady of good, although comparatively poor, family. Her father rejoiced in the title of an Irish landlord, but the rent roll of the estate was not very considerable, and it needed dexterous management to keep it from the withering grasp of the encumbered estates court. Still, out of their slender resources, Miss Percival's parents had given her a superior education. She could draw, she was a skillful and good musician, she was an elegant horsewoman, and otherwise accomplished. Her manners were free and natural, sometimes a little childlike or hoydenish. She was a little, and but a little, above the average stature of her sex, had a graceful mien, and a sweet face. If I were expert in drawing pen and ink sketches after the manner of a novelist, I should describe this lady as an almost perfect woman. The reader will understand that I have, in this description, anticipated the narrative so far as to let him know more of the lady and gentleman than I could learn within a period of 2 months. You will excuse my candor, sir, I hope, but I fail to see the grounds for your suspicion of your wife. I like your candor. It is reassuring. I may be mistaken. I devoutly pray that I am. You have, I am told, had great expertise in such painful domestic affairs as that I now trouble you with. It is already a source of much comfort to me that I have consulted you. If you can remove the horrid doubts which oppress me, I shall esteem you my benefactor. But let me know the truth, whatever it may be. I again begged him to be a little more precise than he had been in detailing the cause of his suspicions. In solemn confidence, I may say that we were at a dinner party at the house of Mr. Talboys in Seymour Place, the week before last, and it was impossible to avoid noticing her freedom with young Lord Swellington and Colonel Forrester. The Colonel, I said. He's a man of 60. He has seen much hard service and is a lion in every party just now, I've heard. Were not your wife's attentions the mere courtesies which all true women find pleasure in bestowing upon age and bravery? That might be. But what do you say about her pleasantry with the conceited and empty-headed young fop, Lord Swellington? These might be the innocent railings and badinage of the purest women. Ladies sometimes take cruel pleasure in trifling with, just to mortify, the fop in whatever grade of society he may be found. I sincerely hope you are right, but unhappily, these have not been the only causes of my grief. My wife is too fond of pleasure. We have lately been to 2 public breakfasts, one given by Lady W. at Kew, and the other by the Marchioness of L. at Chiswick. That, pardon my suggesting, under the most adverse, and at the same time rational, estimate of human character, betrays only something of levity, quite consistent with the pure of heart and the strictest rectitude of conduct. You are not, I am glad to say, an uncharitable interpreter of human conduct. Indeed, I hope not, for although I have seen much wickedness, and a vast deal of subtle as well as patent crime, I have met with many instances in which unjust suspicions have provoked calamities. But was there anything, and if so, what was there, in the conduct of your wife to justify your suspicions about her? Well, she flirted with every gentleman present at each party, young and old. With every one? Yes, or nearly so. That is enough to show the groundlessness of your apprehensions. Mrs. Percival may have been too richly endowed with such vivacity, but my suspicion is that her freedom arises in great part from her conscious guilelessness and her moral self-possession. Again, I say I hope you may be right, and I wrong. Why so emphasize the word hope? Have you observed any other instances of what you deem your wife's impropriety? Yes, he replied with a sigh. Relate them. The other day, my wife induced me to take her to the flower show, held in the gardens of the Botanic Society, Regent's Park. She asked you to take her, I interposed. Yes, and I did so. I yield everything she desires. And why not, as I am not certain that her affections wander. Quite correct, but did anything occur there? Perhaps you deem it nothing. She hung on the arm of Colonel Forrester for a couple of hours. The old Indian colonel? Yes. Well, really, I do not see anything in that. I happened to be at the show myself with Mrs. Forrester, and a distinguished relative of ours. I remember that among the flowers were several oriental plants, which our florists have succeeded in naturalizing. This is one of the most common incidences of the flower show. I wish I could look upon these things as you do. A single incident of the kind might not have aroused my apprehensions, but so many, and at various times, furnish a collective evidence impossible to resist. How long have you been married? A little more than 2 years. Any family? No. I was quite convinced, as the reader must be, that there was really nothing in the conduct of Mrs. Percival to justify the cruel suspicions of her husband. His employment of me would, I saw, be one of the absurdest things he could very well do. Should I allow him to employ me? Ought I permit myself to be used as a spy upon his wife's movements, being so firmly convinced as I was of her innocence? The mystery of this jealousy was capable of a simple explanation. The lady had been endowed by nature with a somewhat of a mercurial disposition, which her education had done little to check. The very scenes in which her girlhood had been spent had inspired her with a wild or playful tendency. Nothing in her married life had yet happened to curb or control the innocent gaiety, or it might be waywardness, of her disposition. Had her union with Mr. Percival been blessed by offspring, of which it is needless to say there was yet no ground for despair, it is most probable that at dinner parties she would have been a less attractive member, at public breakfast she would have been less chatty or facetious, at flower shows a less anxious inquirer. But should I, or should I not, undertake to confirm or remove the unjust husband's suspicions? Upon this I could not make up my mind. I required time for consideration. It was arranged that Mr. Percival should see me again in 3 days. During the interval between his first and second visits, I carefully balanced reason for and against the engagement, and at length resolved to accept it. If I did not undertake it, I knew others would, if it were offered them. If they took it in hand, I was not at all sure that they would perform their task with becoming delicacy and consideration. I thought it not improbable that some rude or vulgar man might be instructed, and that he might, by starting on his inquiry with a foregone conclusion of the lady's guilt, so interpret what he saw of her free conduct as to increase her husband's jealousy. On the other hand, if I undertook the affair, I doubted not the result would be the vindication of Mrs. Percival in her husband's eyes. Mr. Percival punctually kept his appointment with me. He was the first to speak. "I hope," he said, "you have agreed to assist me." "I have." "Well, I shall feel grateful to you when you have probed the truth. Doubly grateful if you can prove that my doubts about my wife are unfounded." "I expect to earn that double gratitude." "Be it so," he said with great emphasis. "It is no drawback on your professional merits, to my mind, that you have already formed an opinion that my wife is as good as I could wish her, and that I am a jealous fool. I should not like to know that you have condemned her beforehand. I am persuaded that you will do your duty faithfully towards me, and considerably towards her." I promised him that much. There was a ball at Almack's the very next day. Mrs. Percival was to be there, and so was her husband. They would go separately, after the manner of the ton, she to her brougham, and he to his cab. I did not think Almack's a desirable place to begin my inquiries in. It would not be easy for me to gain admissions into the closest of all assemblies. Although I could have encompassed that as I had before, I preferred a standpoint of observation where etiquette was less rigid. Next week there was to be a grand fancy ball, under a potent body of lady patronesses, for the relief of starvation of Whitechapel, and Mrs. Percival, acting under the feeble light of conventional charity, thought it her duty to buy a ticket. Price 1 guinea, of which an infinitesimal portion was netted for the indigent, and to largely patronize her dressmaker and milliner in proof of her intense sympathy with the famishing poor. I attended this ball, and was sickened by its palpable mockery of the distress it was ostensibly designed to relieve. But I must not get off track of my narrative to moralize. At this ball I saw nothing to justify a suspicion of impropriety on the part of Mrs. Percival. Nor did I at the flower show, which was held in the grounds of the Crystal Palace in Sydenham. Nor at the public breakfast, which the Marchioness of L. gave in her grounds at Cheswick. A more private scrutiny of the lady's movements also went to prove her strictly virtuous in character. I now got wearied and half disgusted with my task, and brought it to an end by reporting to Mr. Percival my absolute conviction of his wife's innocence and purity. He received my statements without offering any opinion upon it, and it was evident that he was not quite satisfied with it. It had, I dare say, weakened his suspicions, but it had not destroyed them. I was sorry for the imperfect result, but I could do no more than I had done for his satisfaction. I often mused and reflected over this curious case. What could have given rise to these suspicions in the mind of such a man as Mr. Percival? I set it down to incompatibility of temper. He was somewhat studious and retiring man. His wife, although a good woman as ever drew breath, was a light and somewhat volatile person. In many respects, I argued this was an incongruous union. I thought I saw inevitable misery for both husband and wife in the future. About a year after I finished my proper business with Mr. and Mrs. Percival, I was waited upon by an eminent London solicitor, who knew nothing of my former engagement, for the purpose of tracing the retreat of that gentleman, who had deserted his wife and was hiding from all his friends. My visitor, the private solicitor of Mr. Percival, had not heard from him since or about his flight. It was not supposed that any violence had befallen him, although it was hard to say what harm might befall him. His physician had advised that he had been suffering from one of the 1,000 forms of one of the 100 branches of that disorder known by the familiar collective title of insanity. It was a mild and harmless type of the disease, a species of melancholia. The friends of the unfortunate gentleman were anxious to discover and perhaps secretly watch over him. At worst, place him under gentle and temporary restraint, as he was known to be a man of high and honorable ambition, very likely to obtain and worthily fill a seat in Parliament unless his prospects were marred. Publicity, scandal, or gossip on the subject of his bereavement was to be deprecated. I accepted this engagement, and I thought it desirable to let the solicitor know of the previous retainer given me by Mr. Percival, so that he might reinstate the facts to the physician, who would thereby gain some insight into the secret of the gentleman's misfortune. We had no clue to Mr. Percival's whereabouts. Certain facts led us to imagine he had not left this country, but I put myself in communication with the French and Belgian police as the best mode of tracing him if he had crossed the sea. They had all the provincial papers filed at Peely's and the Deacon's coffee houses critically scanned, so that if any harm befell him, I should hear of it. This was a precaution I added to the usual police inquiry through the hue and cry. One day I got intelligence through a West England paper that a gentleman, answering to the description of Mr. Percival, had been found wandering along the coast in a state which indicated mental disorganization. I lost no time in proceeding to the spot, with the doctor and Mrs. Percival, who insisted upon being of the party. We claimed the poor man, who yielded himself up to our control like an infant. We brought him to London and took apartments for him in the western suburb, so as to be out of the eye of gossips and near that of his physician. It is perhaps needless to say that his wife attended on him mainly with her own hands, and would let none but the rudest offices be performed by any other person. Carriage rides, gentle exercise, and tonic medicines told beneficially on the patient day by day, so that in a few weeks, under the doctor's advice, arrangements were made to take him in his own yacht to the north of Europe. The physician explained to me that the secret of his malady was disappointment or impatient ambition. He was an only son. He had inherited with his father's property that gentleman's desire to establish a house. He feared that the curse of sterility had befallen upon him or his wife, and the constant brooding over this thought had curdled jealousy in his heart. In the north of Europe, Mr. Percival's mental health was completely restored. On his return to England, he called upon me, and thanked me very sincerely for the part I had played in the narrative I have described, stating that if anything could exceed the claims I had upon his gratitude for the attention I had bestowed upon him, it would be the faithful manner in which I had combated and sought to destroy his unfounded suspicion of his wife. A better or nobler woman did not, he said, exist. She had, he feared, impaired her health by her vigilant attention to him during his illness, and the only grief he now had was the apprehension that, being enceinte, the change of air, and continental travel, which had just been recommended for her sake, would be inadequate to restore a vigor and tone to her delicate system. I am happy, however, in being able to state that these fears have not been realized. Mr. and Mrs. Percival, who are among the very happiest people in the world, the health of both in mind and in body being as nearly perfect as they can be, have 2 sons, with the prospect of contributing more guarantees against the termination of their pedigree in this generation. The End. End of section 21. End of Secret Service or Recollections of a City Detective by Andrew Forrester.